Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I had always loved staying at old, remote hotels. They were full of character and mystery, and I had this strange habit of imagining the stories they held within their walls. So, when I found a secluded, run-down inn, hidden away in a mountain town, I couldn't resist. It was a small place, nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering trees. The kind of inn where you don't expect anyone to come through the door for days. The owner, an older woman named Agnes, was pleasant but quiet. She gave me a key to a room at the end of a long, creaky hallway. The room was exactly what I had hoped for. Faded wallpaper, a heavy wooden bed, and an antique mirror on the wall. It felt as if time had stopped. I loved it. That evening, after unpacking, I decided to explore the inn. The hallway was dim, with only a few light bulbs flickering overhead. As I walked toward the stairs, I noticed a door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, weathered, scratched, like it had been locked for years. Curious, I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, and there was no key in sight. A chill ran through me. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or superstitions, but something about that door unsettled me. I quickly walked back to my room. Later that night, after dinner, I went to bed early. The room was cold, and the sound of wind howling outside made me feel even more isolated. I settled under the heavy covers and shut my eyes. The clock ticked away, and then I heard it, a faint sound at the door, a soft scraping. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was just the house settling. But then it came again, clearer this time, a slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging across the wood. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The air in the room felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The scratching continued. It was coming from the door, but I hadn't heard anyone pass by. It was too late for anyone to be outside. My breath quickened. I stood up, moved toward the door, and placed my ear against it. The sound stopped. I backed away, my mind racing. I was alone, at least I thought I was. I hadn't seen anyone else in the hall since I'd arrived. I glanced nervously around. The room. The only thing that seemed out of place was the antique mirror. It had always given me an odd feeling, but now it was impossible to ignore. My pulse quickened as I noticed something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow behind me, moving. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was gone. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but the night only grew more unsettling. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if something was near, watching me. At around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and went into the hall, hoping to find Agnes or someone else awake. The hallway was still, deathly quiet. But as I passed the door at the end of the hall, the one I had tried earlier, the scratching returned, louder this time, unmistakable. I turned the handle again, and this time, it opened. Inside was a small room, barely, bigger than a closet, filled with old furniture and a musty smell. But it wasn't the room that made my heart stop. It was what was hanging on the wall, a framed photograph of a woman. The woman looked familiar, but it wasn't until I looked closer that I realized it was me. My blood ran cold. The woman in the picture had my face, but her eyes were dark, hollow, and behind her, just barely visible in the corner, was a figure standing in the shadows. I stumbled back, horror sinking in. Someone had been in my room. Someone had been watching me. I bolted down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the stairs and saw Agnes standing at the bottom, her face pale. She was staring up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Why?" I gasped. "Because," she whispered, "you were never meant to stay here. The man, he watches everyone who stays, and when they leave, they never leave alone." Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. The air turned freezing cold. I turned to see the figure from the photograph standing at the top of the stairs. And then the scratching started again. The figure didn't move, but the nails. They were coming for me. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places. So, when a friend mentioned an old hospital on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. They said it was off limits, but that only made it more enticing. It was late in the evening when we arrived, the building towering over us like a forgotten monument. The windows were cracked, and the metal gates creaked as if warning us to turn back. But we didn't. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked, already setting up his flashlight. I grinned. "What's the worst that could happen?" We snuck inside through a broken window. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay hit me instantly. The halls stretched out before us, endless and dark. A few flickering lights above cast long, eerie shadows on the cracked tiles. It felt like the walls were breathing, alive with the history of the place. We explored for what felt like hours, taking photos, joking nervously, and daring each other to venture deeper into the heart of the building. But when we reached the old surgical ward, the mood shifted. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the silence here felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. The room was empty, save for the rusted, abandoned equipment. As I shined my flashlight around, my beam landed on something strange. A door at the far end of the room barely cracked open. "Did we check that one?" I asked, walking toward it without waiting for a response. Jake was right behind me, but his steps were quieter now, more hesitant. "I don't know. It doesn't feel right." I ignored him. The door creaked open on its own, and the room beyond was pitch black. For a second, I stood frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then a sharp noise echoed from within, the sound of something scraping against the floor. Jake's breath hitched behind me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly. Something was definitely in there, but I couldn't turn back. The adrenaline was too strong. I pushed the door open further, and the beam of my flashlight revealed the interior, an old elevator, its door half open, revealing a dark shaft beyond. Before I could react, Jake grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The elevator's doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The lights above flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving us in absolute darkness. I could hear Jake's panicked breathing beside me. The air in the elevator felt colder, and a strange pressure built, like something was moving in the shadows around us. Suddenly, a voice whispered through the dark. It was faint at first, a soft, raspy breath against the back of my neck. "Help. Me?" I froze. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or something more sinister, but the whisper came again, louder this time, desperate. "Help. Me. Please." I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. There was nothing but darkness. "We have to get out of here," Jake hissed, pulling at the elevator's emergency button. But it didn't work. The floor beneath us trembled, and the elevator began to descend. Slowly, unnervingly so. Each floor passed with an agonizing slowness, and with each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding us, pressing in on all sides. "Help me! Help me!" Suddenly, the elevator stopped. Not at a floor, but at a point between floors, suspended in midair. And the whispers? They stopped too. There was silence. I didn't want to move, but I had no choice. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure Jake could hear it. We reached for the door, pushing it open slowly, only to find ourselves staring into a pitch-black void. The walls around us were smooth, no floor, no ground. Just a dark pit that seemed to stretch on forever. That's when I saw it. A figure, thin and pale, its eyes wide and empty, staring directly at us from the abyss. Its lips parted, but no sound came from it, only a cold, unsettling air. Its face was twisted in agony. It was waiting. Before I could react, the elevator shook. Violently, the walls seemed to close in, pressing against us. I could feel the cold, damp air around me, thick with something foul and ancient. And then, as quickly as it all started, the elevator began its ascent again. We shot up through the building, the sound of the elevator's old mechanisms grinding, and just as abruptly as we'd entered, we were back at the top. The doors opened into the hospital's empty lobby. I turned to Jake, who was breathing heavily beside me. His eyes were wide, filled with fear. "We need to get out of here, right now." I didn't need to be told twice. We ran for the exit, not stopping until we reached my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the dark, looming structure in my rearview mirror, only to see that one of the windows at the top floor was wide open, and behind it, the same pale, empty face pressed against the glass, watching me leave. I was alone in my apartment, something I rarely was. I usually liked the company of roommates, but everyone had gone out, and I had the place to myself. The quiet should have been a relief, but instead, it felt off, like the air was too still. It was late when I heard the first knock, soft, barely noticeable, but it was there. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then it came again, 3 sharp knocks at my front door. I froze. It was after midnight. No one should have been here. I checked the peephole, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty. I convinced myself I had imagined it, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks, but just as I turned away, there was a sudden, louder knock. I opened the door slowly, peering into the hall, still expecting no one. But there, just beyond the door, stood a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, dressed in a tattered suit, his hair wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide, unnaturally so, as though he hadn't blinked in hours, maybe days. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice shaky but sharp. "Can you help me?" Confused and a little scared, I stepped back. "Help you with what?" The man's eyes flickered toward the hallway. "I don't have anywhere to go. Can I stay with you, just for a little while?" I hesitated. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just turn him away. He seemed desperate. I nodded reluctantly and let him inside. The moment the door closed behind him, I felt a shift in the air. It was as if the apartment had gotten colder, the shadows deeper. He sat down on the couch without a word, staring at the wall with a strange, vacant expression. I offered him a drink, but he didn't respond. The silence between us grew, heavy and unnerving. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice tight. His head snapped toward me, his gaze intense, almost piercing. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to stare. His lips moved, but the words didn't match the sound that came out. The voice didn't even seem like his. Too distorted, too hollow. "I can't leave," the voice said, not from his mouth, but from somewhere deeper inside him. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. "What do you mean, you can't leave?" Smiled, a slow, creeping smile that made my stomach twist. "I've been waiting for you, waiting for the invitation." I backed away, but the man stood up too, moving with an unnerving speed. His eyes glowed, but not in the way that made them appear alive, more like 2 black holes. The air grew colder, the shadows in the apartment stretching unnaturally long. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. "I don't know you," I gasped, my mind spiraling. "What do you want from me?" His lips curled into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm here to stay, whether you want me to or not." "You opened the door." I ran to the front door, but it was locked. I yanked the handle, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around me seemed to close in, the room distorting. The man's distorted voice echoed from all around. "I'm part of you now," he said. "You invited me in." I turned, heart hammering in my chest. The man was standing directly behind me now, his breath cold against my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty again. I ran out into the hallway, but the moment I stepped into the building's stairwell, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall, tall, with wild hair, staring right at me. The same figure I had just seen. It was no longer a person. It was a shadow, a presence that loomed over me, suffocating and dark. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall, but the figure was always one step behind me. No matter how fast I ran, it never got any farther away. By the time I reached the ground floor, the hall was silent again. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone anymore. I looked down at my hand, and there, pressed into my skin, was an imprint. His face, twisted and contorted, forever burned into my palm. The door to the outside was wide open. I didn't think twice. I ran out into the night, never looking back. I never went back to that apartment either. But sometimes I can feel the shadow, watching, the knock, the voice. It was just the beginning. I was always a skeptic. Ghosts, curses, hauntings. I never bought into any of it. But that night I came to understand how easily a belief could be shattered. It began like any other evening. I had just moved into a new apartment. Small, old, but affordable. The kind of place no one else seemed to want, and the landlord didn't ask many questions. I wasn't one to care about the past, so I signed the lease without much thought. The apartment had its quirks. Creaky floorboards, a draft in the kitchen, and an old, full-length mirror in the hallway. It was the mirror that caught my attention. The first night, something about it felt wrong. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but every time I walked past it I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The reflection seemed too slow to catch up with my movements. Like a moment's delay, just enough to make you doubt. I tried to ignore it. A mirror is a mirror, right? But then, one night, I noticed something different. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The reflection was blurry, the outline of my figure slightly distorted. I didn't think much of it until my reflection smiled, just a little. A small, unnerving twist of the lips. I froze, spat out my toothpaste, and rushed to the hallway. Nothing. The mirror reflected nothing but an empty hallway. I laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion or a trick of the light. But the next day, the same thing happened. Only this time, it wasn't a smile. My reflection in the mirror didn't move when I did. It stayed perfectly still, locked in an expression I couldn't quite place. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I stared at the glass, willing my reflection to react, to mimic me. But it just stood there, staring back. I wanted to leave, but I didn't. Something kept me there, watching, like a train wreck I couldn't turn away from. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mirror was calling me in a way I couldn't describe. I walked into the hallway and stood in front of it, my breath shallow. I watched myself for what felt like hours, willing the reflection to do something, anything, and then it did. My reflection raised a hand, slower than mine, and then it grinned. Not like a normal grin. It was wide, too wide. Far, beyond what my lips could stretch, and it stayed there, as though it had no intention of stopping. I backed away, my legs shaking. The thing in the mirror didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and buried my head under the covers. But sleep didn't come. The image of that grin haunted me. The next morning, I decided to leave. I would go stay with a friend, just until I figured out what to do. But when I walked out of my bedroom, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The hallway was different. It wasn't just the angle of the light. It was as if the walls had shifted slightly. The air felt thicker, colder, as though the space had grown somehow. I hesitated, then stepped closer to the mirror. This time, there was no hesitation. My reflection was waiting for me. It wasn't me anymore. The face in the mirror was twisted, elongated, like something had stretched it too far. The eyes were wide, almost hollow, the lips pulled back into that same grotesque grin. But this time it moved. The reflection moved independently of me. It raised its hand, tapping on the glass, its fingers contorting unnaturally. I stumbled, backward, my breath caught in my throat. The reflection leaned forward, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes, they weren't just empty. They were aware. It knew I was watching. And then it spoke, its voice low, rasping, like nails. On a chalkboard, let me out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The voice came again, louder, demanding. Let me out. I ran. I don't know how, but I found myself back in the bedroom, locked inside, my heart racing, the air heavy with dread. But I could hear it, scratching, at the door. No, not at the door. At the mirror. I couldn't stay. But I couldn't leave either. There was no way to escape it. The mirror had changed. The space inside it was no longer the hallway I had known. It was dark, with a shadow, moving behind the glass, a shadow that had been waiting. The last thing I saw before I ran was my reflection, pressing its face to the mirror again. Its grin was gone, replaced by something worse. Anger. Rage, palpable in its eyes. As I left the apartment and slammed the door behind me, the sound of something scratching, scraping against glass echoed in my mind. I didn't look back. I didn't want to, but the reflection had already moved. I could feel it, watching me, waiting for the next person to step into its reach. And I knew I had to leave, forever. Some mirrors, I've learned, don't reflect what's there. They reflect what's waiting. And some reflections aren't just waiting, they're plotting. I never looked into another mirror again. I moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, the one in the old brick building at the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and I wasn't picky. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. I liked the solitude. It was the middle of the night when it first happened. I had just gotten into bed, my lights off, and the apartment silent, when I heard the knock. One knock, clear and deliberate. I froze. It came from the door. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor, but when I checked the peephole, no one was there. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just imagining things. I locked the door again and went back to bed, the silence thick in the air. A few nights later, the knock came again. Just one. At first, I thought it was some prank, but as I stood in front of the door this time, I noticed something strange. The hallway light was flickering. It wasn't a power surge, more like something else, something unnatural, like it was struggling to stay on. My pulse quickened. I leaned in closer to the door and put my ear against it. The silence was almost suffocating until I heard a soft whisper. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. There was no one out there. I backed away from the door, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next knock. I didn't hear anything for a while, but then, there it was. The knock came again, louder this time. I jumped. The apartment felt colder, the shadows seemed longer. But this time, I did something different. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly unlocked the door, heart hammering in my chest. When I opened it, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the light still flickering. There was no one there. I checked the other apartments, but no one was around. I closed the door, my mind racing. What was going on? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The knocks kept coming, always at night, always the same. One knock, and then that voice. "You're not alone." Finally, after days of sleepless nights, I decided to confront whatever it was. I waited, the knife in my hand, as the clock ticked toward midnight. As soon as the knock sounded, I rushed to the door, but this time, something was different. The door was moving on its own. It creaked open a fraction, and I could see a shadow through the gap. I didn't want to open it further, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out and I pushed the door open completely. The hallway was darker now, darker than it had ever been. I could barely see anything, but then I saw it. There, standing at the end of the hall, a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadows. It was wearing something that looked like an old, tattered coat, its arms long and unnaturally thin. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of it standing still, waiting. For the first time, I felt pure terror. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it in my bones. I slammed the door shut. The knock came again. But this time, I didn't answer. Instead, I ran. I grabbed my things, my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, through the lobby. I didn't stop running until I was outside. I called the landlord the next morning, explained everything. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach twist. "You're not the first to report this," he said. "The building, it has a history." "History?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The knock, the visitor. It's been here for years. Every tenant hears it. It's always the same. One knock, and then it shows up." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was hang up. I never went back. To this day, I never hear a knock when I'm at home. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear a whisper. "You're not alone." The storm came without warning. One moment, the night was calm, and the next, the winds howled, lashing the old farmhouse with rain that came down in sheets. I had just moved into the house. It was isolated, far from the nearest town, but it was cheap, and I was eager to start fresh. I sat in the kitchen, reading by the dim light of a flickering lamp, when I heard the first knock. It was soft, but it sent a chill through me. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one even knew I had moved in yet. I stood and made my way to the front door, heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. I opened it slowly. No one. Just the storm. Outside. Confused, I stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard. Nothing. Just the trees swaying violently in the wind. I was about to close the door when I heard it again. This time from inside the house. A distinct, sharp knock on the wall. Froze, my blood running cold. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but it was unmistakable. I went back inside, my pulse thudding in my ears. I moved cautiously down the hall, following the sound, which now seemed to come from the living room. I reached the door and stopped, just before pushing it open. The room was pitch black. The lamp on the side table was out, and the room felt wrong. I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to leave. The floor creaked underfoot, and I strained to hear any sound, but it was just silence. Then I felt it, a cold breath on my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. I whirled around, but there was no one there, just shadows in the corners of the room, stretching and twisting in the dim moonlight that filtered through the curtains. I couldn't breathe. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Panic surged through me. The air felt thick, heavy, and then the knocking began again. Louder this time, coming from the far corner of the room. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. The knocking was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was tapping a finger against the wall, just out of sight. I could feel its presence in the room, something watching me, waiting. I was not alone. In the corner, where the shadows seemed darkest, I saw movement. A figure, half-formed, emerging from the corner. It was tall, skeletal, its arms too long, reaching for me. The knocking stopped, and the figure's hollow eyes locked onto mine. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It moved toward me with jerky, unnatural steps, like it was struggling to keep its form together. With each step, the room grew colder until I could see my breath in the air. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, staring at the thing as it got closer, its head tilting unnaturally, its mouth opening with a horrible screeching sound. Then the door behind me flew open with a loud bang, and I darted for it, bolting into the hallway. I didn't stop running. I ran straight out of the house, into the storm, not caring about anything but getting as far from that thing as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, breathless and terrified. They let me in, though they seemed confused. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The house was empty, they told me. No one had lived there for years. I stayed with the neighbors for the night. The next morning, I went back to the farmhouse to retrieve some of my things, but when I opened the door, everything was as it had been when I left. Silent, still, and untouched. Except for one thing. The wall in the living room was covered in deep, fresh knocks, like someone had been tapping on it just waiting for me to come back. I never went back inside. It was a cold evening when I first noticed the house across the street. I'd lived in the neighborhood for years, but this house was new to me. It had appeared overnight, standing at the end of the cul-de-sac like it had always been there. At first, I thought it was just a strange new property, maybe built while I was away on vacation. But there was something about it. The windows were too dark, even for nighttime. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, with peeling paint. That seemed older than the house itself. The strangest part, though, was the staircase in the front yard. It wasn't attached to the house, it was just a set of stone steps leading up to nothing, like a forgotten monument. I couldn't look away. Days passed, and I watched it every time I walked past. The stairs were always there, looming. It wasn't, until the following Friday, that I saw someone standing on them. A man. He was thin, dressed in all black and staring at the empty space above the steps. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but every night after that, I saw him again, standing in the same place, unblinking, motionless. I asked around, but no one else seemed to notice. Neighbors said the house had always been there. One night, after weeks of growing unease, I couldn't resist anymore. I had to know what was at the top of those stairs. I walked over to the house, heart racing in my chest. The air felt heavier as I approached the stone steps, and when I placed my foot on the first one, a shiver ran down my spine. The man was standing there again. But this time, he looked at me. His eyes were hollow, black pits. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. Low, raspy, like it had come from somewhere deep inside the earth. I froze, every part of me screaming to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. I wanted to turn and leave, but I couldn't. My gaze was drawn upward, past the man, to the empty space above the stairs. That's when I saw it. The stairs kept going, into the air. The stone steps stretched higher, disappearing into a dark void that swallowed everything around them. "Go ahead," the man whispered, his voice dripping with something darker. "Climb the stairs. They won't stop you." I took a step, just one, then another. Something was pulling me up, tugging at my mind like an invisible hand, urging me to keep going. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching. The higher I climbed, the colder it became. The air around me thickened until I could barely breathe. With each step, the world below faded into nothingness. I didn't look down. I couldn't. It felt like hours before I reached the top. My legs burned, my heart pounded, but the only thing in front of me was darkness. The stone steps disappeared into an endless abyss. The air was suffocating, and I realized I could no longer hear anything. No birds, no cars, no wind. I turned around to go back, but there was no longer a staircase beneath me. The void had consumed it. I was trapped. Then I heard the voice again, this time right behind me. "Welcome." I spun around, but there was no one there. The darkness stretched out, and I realized it wasn't empty. There were things in the dark, shapes, figures. The shadows moved, shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible. I felt a presence, something that wasn't human, something that had been waiting for me to climb those steps. I ran. My feet didn't touch the ground. I wasn't moving on the stairs anymore. I was falling, plummeting into a vast, infinite nothingness. And then I was back. The wee stairs were gone. The man was gone. The house was gone. I was standing in front of my own house. The sun was rising. The street was calm. Nothing had changed, but I could still hear it. The whisper. "Climb the stairs. They won't stop you." And I knew, in that moment, I would hear it again. Somewhere, beyond the world I knew, the stairs were waiting for me to come back. It was supposed to be a simple night, a quiet evening spent helping my friend Tom move into his new place. He had recently bought an old house at a ridiculously low price, a fixer-upper with charm, as he put it. But I should have known better than to trust my instincts on a deal that cheap. The house was located on the outskirts of town, far from the busy streets. A faded "for sale" sign still hung by the rusted gate when I arrived. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark, with ivy creeping up the stone walls. Tom greeted me at the door, smiling as though he hadn't noticed how unsettling it looked. "Thanks for helping," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "You'll love this place once we get it cleaned up." I smiled, but I wasn't convinced. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. Tom led me inside and we started unloading boxes. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, dust, and something else I couldn't place. After a while, Tom disappeared upstairs to deal with some of the furniture, leaving me to explore. I walked around, finding the usual clutter of an old home, cracked mirrors, faded wallpaper, and warped floorboards. But when I passed through the kitchen, I saw something odd. A small door at the far corner, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It led to a dark stairwell that seemed to disappear into the earth. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer and pushed the door open. A blast of cold air rushed up from the stairs, sending chills down my spine. I could hear faint noises, like creaking wood, from below. Something wasn't right about that cellar. I called up to Tom, but he didn't answer. Shrugging it off, I began my descent. The staircase creaked under my feet, and the air grew colder with each step. The light from above barely reached the bottom. By the time I reached the cellar, I couldn't see anything. I pulled my phone out to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered before going black. I was plunged into darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze. My heart raced. The whispers grew louder, but they didn't sound like Tom. The voice was low, almost guttural, coming from the farthest corner of the cellar. I backed away, trying to find my way back up the stairs, but the whispers grew more frantic, the air colder, and the shadows seemed to shift. I could feel something in the room with me, something watching. My breath quickened, and I knew I had to get out. Suddenly, the phone flickered back on, illuminating the space just enough for me to see a figure standing in the corner. I blinked. The figure wasn't Tom. It was a tall, thin man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open, fixed on me with an unsettling stare. He was dressed in a tattered suit, his skin almost translucent. I turned to run, but as I did, the cellar door slammed shut. I was trapped. The man didn't move, but his eyes followed me as I pounded on the door, yelling for Tom. The whispers turned into a guttural chant, repeating my name over and over, growing louder and louder. The walls of the cellar seemed to close in. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a small wooden box on the floor. It was old, covered in dust, with strange symbols carved into the surface. Without thinking, I grabbed it and opened it. Inside was a small, yellowed note and a key, rusted and old, like it belonged to a different time. In a panic, I shoved the note into my pocket and grabbed the key, fumbling for the lock on the cellar door. As my hand touched the handle, I felt a sharp cold run through my fingers, like an ice-cold hand gripping mine. I jerked back, gasping, and looked up to see the figure had moved closer, his skeletal fingers reaching toward me. I quickly unlocked the door, flinging it open just as his hand brushed against my arm. I didn't look back. I ran up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, until I burst into the main floor and slammed the door behind me. I stood there, panting, eyes wide, with terror. Tom was standing in the hallway, looking confused. "Hey, what happened?" he asked. I glanced at the cellar door, now closed tightly as if nothing had happened. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I stopped. The note in my pocket had slipped out without me noticing. I reached down and pulled it out. The message was scrawled hastily in faded ink. "Don't leave the cellar unlocked." A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to Tom. He was smiling at me now, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Why didn't you come down?" "I was getting worried," he said, his voice oddly distant. I stared at him, my mouth dry, the words catching in my throat. Something wasn't right. I glanced over at the cellar door once more, and this time I could hear it. The whispering again. It was calling my name. It was supposed to be a casual evening hike. My cousin and I had done this trail dozens of times before. It snaked through the hills above the town, offering stunning views of the sunset and just enough challenge to make you feel accomplished. That evening, we set out later than usual, hoping to catch the stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. We didn't think twice when we passed the old sign at the trailhead. It was rusted and illegible, but we knew the path by heart. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the distant chirping of crickets. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows over the trail, making everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. About halfway up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. The sun was a fiery orange, sinking slowly into the horizon. But as the last rays of light faded, we noticed something strange. There was no moon, not even a sliver. The sky was darker than we had ever seen it, like a heavy curtain had been pulled across the stars. The first uneasy feeling crept in then, but neither of us said anything. We turned on our flashlights and kept walking. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us stop. We scanned the area with our flashlights. The beam landed on nothing but branches and leaves. My cousin shrugged it off, muttering something about deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling continued, faint and deliberate, always staying just ahead of us on the trail. We kept walking, faster now, the rhythm of our footsteps breaking the silence. The trail felt different somehow, narrower. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The rustling stopped. We froze, listening. The night had gone completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. My flashlight flickered and my stomach dropped. I smacked it against my palm and the light steadied, but that moment of darkness was enough to make my heart race. Then we heard it, a voice, low and breathy, coming from the trees. Help. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My cousin and I looked at each other, eyes wide. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. Help me. It didn't sound right. The tone was off, hollow, and strained, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was shrouded in shadow, its shape impossible to define. My cousin aimed his flashlight at it, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. It was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it moved like a living thing, jerking slightly as if adjusting to the light. We stood frozen, too scared to run, too scared to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing down the trail. Its arm was too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathe. Then it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The moment it was gone, the forest came alive again. The crickets chirped, the wind rustled the leaves, and it was as if nothing had happened. Without a word, my cousin and I turned and bolted back down the trail, running, as fast as our legs could carry us. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the car, we slammed the doors shut and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until we were back in town. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that voice. It wasn't asking for help. It was calling us in. My cousin and I used to explore the fields behind our grandparents' old farmhouse every summer. The place was vast, with acres of corn and wheat, a rickety barn that seemed like it might collapse any day, and a patch of woods that everyone in the family avoided. Grandpa always said it wasn't safe. Snakes, sinkholes, or some vague story about trespassers. We never believed him. This summer, curiosity got the better of us. On a lazy afternoon, after Grandma fell asleep on the porch, we grabbed flashlights and decided to explore the woods. It wasn't a planned adventure, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The air was cooler under the canopy of trees, the thick smell of moss and earth surrounding us. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the farm disappeared. No wind rustling, the corn, no birds. It felt like stepping into another world. My cousin, always braver than me, joked about finding hidden treasure or an old cabin full of relics. We didn't find treasure. What we found was something else. About half a mile into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure, a stone well covered with moss and half crumbling, like it had been there for centuries. But what was odd wasn't the well itself. It was the carvings on the stones around it. Strange symbols and spirals, etched deep into the surface, uneven like they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. My cousin leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. I expected to see water or maybe just darkness. Instead, there was a dull shimmer, like something metallic reflecting light far below. He whispered something, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on one of the symbols on the well's rim, a crude, jagged spiral. It felt alive, almost pulsing under the flashlight beam. Then we heard it, a voice. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but something low and guttural, echoing faintly from deep inside the well. My cousin stumbled back, dropping his flashlight into the pit. The light flickered as it tumbled down, illuminating the sides of the well as it fell. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow curling along the stone. I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but he just stood there, staring at the well, his mouth slightly open. When I shook him, he finally snapped out of it, muttering, "Did you hear it? It said my name." I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to get out of there. I pulled him away, and we hurried back through the woods, tripping over roots and branches. The air felt heavier now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, we were both gasping for breath. We didn't tell anyone about the well. Not that day, not that summer. But things changed after that. My cousin started sleepwalking, which he'd never done before. He'd wake up outside, standing at the edge of the cornfield, always facing the woods. One night, he woke me up, standing by my bed with a blank expression, saying he needed to go back. I tried to convince him it was just a dream, that the well wasn't real, or, if it was, that it didn't mean anything. But he was adamant. He said it was calling him, that it wasn't finished with us. The last straw came on the final night of the summer. We were packing up to leave the farm when I heard the screen door slam. My cousin was gone. I ran outside, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Grandma and Grandpa were asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods. I found him in the clearing, standing next to the well. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the darkness. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and shined my flashlight into the well. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. The shimmer from before was gone. Instead, there was something climbing up the walls, something with too many limbs, its skin slick and glistening like oil. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a mass of sharp, twisting shapes. I screamed, pulling my cousin away. As we stumbled back, the well went silent again, and the clearing felt empty, lifeless. He finally looked at me, his face pale, and said, "It knows us now." We never spoke about it after that night. The woods were off limits for the rest of the summer, and the next year the farm was sold. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us, and I hear its voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably calling my name. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out, despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum, low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered, fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated, At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. Just the house settling, Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. Could be an animal, Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. It's here, I gasped. It's still here. Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. Leave now, panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It was a clear autumn evening when we decided to take the old dirt road that led up to the old, overgrown orchard. My friends and I had heard stories about the orchard from people in town, though they never seemed to agree on what was true. Some said it was haunted. Others just dismissed it as an old tale. Either way, we figured there was no harm in checking it out. The orchard itself was vast, rows upon rows of crooked, gnarled trees that stretched far beyond where we could see. We wandered through the uneven rows, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet echoing in the stillness. The air was sharp and crisp, but it didn't take long before a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt off. We stopped near the center of the orchard where a large, ancient tree stood alone. Its trunk was thick and hollow, gnarled like it had seen centuries of storms and time. Its branches stretched out in every direction, but many had broken over the years, leaving it with a twisted, skeletal shape. Something about the tree felt familiar, though none of us could place why. We sat beneath its shade, passing around a flask of whiskey, laughing and joking. The evening felt peaceful, almost too calm. The further we moved from the edges of the orchard, the quieter the world became. It was as though the trees had swallowed all sound. As we sat there, something began to change. The laughter tapered off, and we all felt the weight of the silence settle in around us. I glanced around, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The sky had darkened, casting the orchard in a strange, otherworldly glow. The usual sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the calls of distant birds, were gone. The forest beyond the trees was quiet. Then I noticed something out of place. In the distance, between the twisted trunks of the apple trees, there was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its form barely visible in the shadows. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out what it was. It was too far away to see clearly, but its presence felt wrong. I whispered to my friends, pointing toward the figure. They followed my gaze but saw nothing. "It's just the trees playing tricks on you," one of them said, laughing nervously. "Nothing's there." But I knew what I had seen. I could feel its eyes on me, though there was no way to be sure it even had a face. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to blur, as if it was blending into the darkness itself. Then, as if in response to my fear, it began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately. "Let's head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's not right here." As we made our way toward the edge of the orchard, the atmosphere grew, heavier, suffocating. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted limbs reaching out as though they were watching. The figure was gone now, but I could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow just beyond my vision. When we reached the dirt road, we didn't speak much. The eerie stillness of the orchard had left us all shaken, and none of us wanted to turn back and look at what might still be lurking behind us. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that we realized we had left something behind. My phone buzzed as we sat around a fire in someone's backyard. It was a message from one of my friends with only one word: "Look closer." Confused, I opened the photo he had sent. It was a blurry shot, taken just as we left the orchard. In the background, barely visible, there was the figure, standing between the trees, its features obscured but still there, watching. We've never gone back to that orchard, and I pray we never do. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when we decided to explore the old tunnel beneath the city. The tunnel wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't well known either, just a place some kids had talked about exploring years ago. My friends and I, curious and bored, thought it might make for an interesting adventure. None of us expected what we would find. The entrance was hidden under a narrow bridge, overgrown with weeds, covered in graffiti. It smelled of damp earth and decay. As we walked down, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in around us. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless, lit only by the faint glow of our headlights. First, everything felt normal. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our footsteps and the strange whispers of the wind. But the deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease settled over us. My friends joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell we were all on edge. There was something oppressive about the tunnel, as if it had been waiting for us. Then we heard it. Faint, distant at first, like a whisper. "Help! Help!" We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice wasn't loud enough to make sense of, but it seemed to resonate through the tunnel like a ghostly echo. I knew then that we were no longer alone. One of my friends, Sam, called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is someone down there?" The response came again, louder this time. "Help! Help! Please!" This time it was clearer, as if someone was begging us from the darkness. We hesitated, unsure whether to respond or run, but something about the desperation in that voice kept us rooted in place. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was worse than any response. We listened to the sound of our own breathing, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, another sound, soft, dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Please." "Help! I'm trapped," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. We didn't move. The flashlight beams swept the shadows searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to be seen. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light. Suddenly, something shifted. A figure emerged from the blackness. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The shape was twisted, elongated, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, empty and hollow, like voids in the darkness. "Help!" the figure rasped, its voice distorted, as though speaking from a place far beyond our world. We backed away, panic surging through us. The tunnel seemed to stretch further, the walls closing in around us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something we could fight. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tunnel echoed with our footsteps, the strange cries of the figure fading behind us. I didn't stop until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping and trembling. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know what we saw. The tunnel remains beneath the city, hidden, waiting. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but I know better. Something is down there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. I still hear the voice sometimes, calling from the dark, and I know I'll never forget it. It was a typical evening trip through the old countryside, nothing unusual about it. My family and I had decided to take a detour from our usual route, exploring some back roads we hadn't traveled before. The sun had long since set, leaving the world bathed in an eerie twilight. The drive was peaceful at first, the only sounds being the hum of the tires and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. The road wound through dense woods, the trees crowding close on either side, their shadows stretching endlessly. There was no one else around, no cars, no other signs of life. As we rounded a bend, something caught my attention. Faint glimmers in the distance. At first, I thought it was just some old reflectors marking the edge of the road, but they didn't seem to align with the typical placement. They were too frequent and too strange. "What are those?" I asked, pointing out. "The window." My parents exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. "Must be some sort of marker," my dad said, though his voice was unsure. As we drew closer, I realized they weren't markers at all. They were eyes, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the dark, peering out from the trees along the side of the road. They blinked slowly, as if studying us, their pale light casting distorted shadows that flickered and danced. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. There had to be something out there. My heart thudded as we drove past, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road stretched ahead, but the trees grew even denser, their shadows swallowing up any sign of the sky. "Did you see that?" my sister asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I replied, my throat dry. We hadn't gone more than a few miles when we spotted something else, small figures, barely visible, darting through the trees. They weren't human, I could tell that much. Not by the way they moved, not by their unnatural speed. It was as though they were lurking, waiting just beyond the edge of visibility. My parents kept driving, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the car was unbearable. We didn't speak much after that, too afraid to acknowledge what we were seeing. Then came the sound, soft, distant whispers carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as we slowed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking words, not any language I recognized, but there was something deeply unsettling about them, like they were murmuring secrets only we were meant to hear. I leaned forward, trying to hear more, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere, as if they were surrounding us. The trees were alive, swaying gently as though they too were listening. The whispers filled the car, weaving into my thoughts, making me doubt my own sanity. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. We need to get out of here." My mom didn't answer. She was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. My dad's knuckles were white too, and his face was pale, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road. It was tall, emaciated, with long, spindly limbs and a distorted, shadowy face that shifted and contorted as if in agony. The thing didn't move, just stood there, staring at us with those hollow, glowing eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized I couldn't look away. The figure began to step forward, its limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Behind it, others appeared, like specters emerging from the forest, each one more twisted than the last. I could feel my parents slowing the car, but none of us spoke. The world outside was a living nightmare, trees swaying, shadows dancing, and those glowing eyes everywhere. As the figures drew closer, I saw something in their eyes. An emptiness, a hunger. They weren't after us for harm, I realized. No, they didn't need to hurt us. They wanted something more. They wanted to consume our fear. We didn't stop the car, but we didn't speed up either. There was nothing we could do but drive through the nightmare, hoping that if we didn't provoke them, they'd let us pass. And somehow, they did. When we reached the end of that road, the figures had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. None of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened, as though admitting it might make it real again. To this day, we haven't returned to those back roads, and I'm not sure I ever will. The eyes are still out there, waiting, always watching. It was a late autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old, abandoned lighthouse on the edge of the coast. None of us had ever been there, and the place had always been rumored to be haunted. Skeptical, as we all were, we figured it would make for an eerie, atmospheric adventure. The lighthouse stood tall against the backdrop of a dark, churning sea. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of an old wooden pier as we parked the car a few miles down the narrow, winding road. The air was heavy with mist and the salty tang of the ocean. We all felt the shift in the atmosphere as we stepped out of the car, the warmth of the day fading fast. As we approached the base of the lighthouse, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself was watching us. The structure loomed in front of us, its once pristine white paint now weathered and peeling. The steps spiraled upwards into the sky, vanishing into the dense fog that had rolled in. "We'll split up," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. "That way, we cover more ground. One of us can check out the bottom while the rest go up." Against my better judgment, we agreed. I could feel the weight of the ancient stone beneath my feet as I started climbing, the sounds of my friend's footsteps fading below. Each creaking step seemed louder than the last, the wind growing stronger as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the colder the air became. I paused, turning back to glance at the fog that now swallowed the ground below. My heart pounded in my chest. It was so quiet, except for the sound of my own breath and the faint echo of the wind. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the narrow space of the lighthouse. The view from the top was breathtaking. Mist rolling in every direction, the sea stretching out beyond the horizon, waves crashing against the rocks below. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as if it had a weight of its own. The sound of the wind was different now, more oppressive, as if it carried something more than just the chill of the ocean. I turned to scan the interior of the lighthouse, its walls lined with faded photographs of sailors and their families, some so old they were barely recognizable. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing by the window, its shape barely distinguishable from the fog. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw its outline, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt frozen as the figure turned, slightly, facing me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, like a ghostly silhouette against the window. The wind howled louder, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. My legs trembled as I slowly backed away, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. Suddenly, I heard voices below. "Guys, where are you?" It was Matt, his voice frantic. "Come on, we need to get out of here." "Matt," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. "There's something up here." Before I could react, the figure began to move, floating towards me with unnatural grace. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the narrow stairs. I could feel the presence closing in, the figure growing larger with every step I took down. When I finally reached the bottom, my friends were waiting, eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I managed to say, breathless. "It was up there, watching me." The rest of the night passed in silence. We didn't speak much as we packed up and left the lighthouse behind. The figure, whatever it was, haunted my thoughts, its hollow gaze etched in my mind. I still don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself staring out into the fog, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching from the distance. I've always been a night owl. I'd spend hours driving back roads, listening to music, or just getting lost in thought. One night, I decided to take a different route home, one that looped through fields and quiet country roads. It was the kind of night where the stars felt closer, the sky so vast and clear it seemed to stretch forever. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but farmland. The fields stretched out on either side of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, isolated but serene. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. The silhouette was tall and thin, almost too thin, with its arms outstretched like it was waving. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights illuminating it. But it wasn't a scarecrow. It had a face, long, gaunt, and pale, like something that had been buried for years. Its hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't seem to recognize me. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure didn't shift, didn't run. It just stood there, watching me. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. My car idled, the engine humming softly. Then, just as I was about to drive away, it moved. Not toward me, but away. It turned slowly and walked into the fields, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I seen? A hallucination? A prank? I drove home that night, my hands trembling on the wheel, but I couldn't forget the image, the figure. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that felt rooted in the very land itself. Even now, years later, I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the fields, waiting for someone to cross its path again. It was the kind of summer evening where the air feels thick, almost suffocating. My friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned amusement park that was rumored to be haunted. The place had been closed for decades, forgotten, overgrown, and left to rot. We weren't really sure what we expected to find, but the idea of exploring something so eerie felt like the perfect escape from the humdrum of our usual lives. As we parked near the entrance, the silence was oppressive. The old, rusted gates groaned as we pushed them open, the metal scraping against itself. The ground was uneven beneath our feet, with weeds and tall grass creeping up through the cracks in the concrete. It felt as though time had stopped. We walked through the overgrown pathways, stepping carefully to avoid the broken glass and twisted remnants of rides that once filled this place with laughter. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its rusted frame creaking in the faint breeze. We weren't exactly sure what we were hoping to find, but the air was thick with a strange tension that made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper into the park, the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Shadows stretched long and distorted, casting unsettling shapes on the decaying attractions. The further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and wind seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of our own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Then came the first sign that something wasn't right. We came across the old carousel. The once bright-painted horses were now faded and covered in moss. We stopped in front of it, the air suddenly feeling colder. I could see my breath in the dim light. Something felt off. I had this overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. Noticed a strange figure standing by the far side of the carousel, just beyond the broken tracks. It was tall, too tall, with a gaunt, skeletal frame that seemed unnaturally elongated. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing us with its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." They turned, following my gaze. At first, they didn't see it, but when they did, they froze. The figure stood still, its hollow black eyes staring at us. There was no face, just a void where its features should have been. It didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice shaking. We turned to run, but as we did, there was a sudden, sharp sound behind us. The slow creak of the carousel. I dared to look back, and there it was, moving. The horses spun, but there was no sound, just the grotesque image of the figure standing there, watching us. We ran, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to get back to the car. The park seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around us. Every time I looked back, I could see the figure, always there, always watching. When we finally stumbled out onto the road, we didn't stop running until we reached town. The park faded, behind us, swallowed by darkness. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was a quiet Sunday evening when I decided to take a drive through the old, deserted countryside. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just the open road and the fading light of the sun dipping beneath the horizon. The trees lining. The road swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. I loved these kinds of trips, especially when everything felt so still. The world seemed smaller out here, as though it had been untouched by time. But as the sun set and the last bit of daylight faded, I began to feel that familiar unease creep in. The road was narrow, winding through endless fields on either side. Occasionally, a farmhouse would come into view, but they were all dark and lifeless. As the miles stretched on, I found myself longing for a sign of life, anything to break the silence. The radio was silent, no stations picking up, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. It was about halfway through my journey when I spotted something strange off to the side of the road, a figure standing by a mailbox completely still. At first, I thought maybe someone was waiting for a ride or walking, back from a long walk. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. I slowed my car, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, like a statue carved from stone. It wasn't, until I passed, that I realized something even more unsettling. There was no house behind it. No house. Just an empty field that stretched on forever. I instinctively glanced in my rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. I didn't stop to think about it too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I told myself it was the isolation, the quiet, making me paranoid. But as I drove further, the same sensation returned. It was like I wasn't alone. Every curve of the road, every shadow cast by the trees felt darker than it should. I couldn't shake the idea that someone, or something, was watching me. I reached for my phone again, hoping for even the slightest signal. Nothing. My stomach tightened as I clenched the steering wheel. The road felt endless, and with every passing mile, that growing sense of unease dug deeper into me. It wasn't until I rounded a bend that I saw it, a figure standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing against the pavement. My headlights illuminated it, and I could see the outline clearly. It wasn't human. The shape was tall, much taller than any person should be. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, long, and its head tilted at a strange angle. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road. My breath hitched, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. I knew I couldn't drive past it. I wasn't sure if I even could. My foot hovered over the brake, but the figure remained unmoving. It was as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I sat there, frozen, until the silence became deafening. The air felt heavy, almost as if the very space around me had grown colder. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I realized I couldn't look away. It was like I was in a trance, my mind screaming to do something, anything, but my body refused to respond. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take the tension any longer, the figure moved, not forward, but upward. Its limbs stretched even more, reaching far above the car. And then, as if sensing my panic, it began to turn its head, slowly, as if observing me with curiosity. Its eyes, if it had any, seemed to pierce through the windshield. The next few moments felt like they stretched on forever, but then I did something I've never done before. I floored the gas pedal. My car roared to life, and I sped past the figure, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it, still standing, still watching. But there was no fear on its face. Just a quiet, hollow gaze, as it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station much further down the road, where I finally managed to get a signal. I called my friends, my voice shaky as I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. How could they? Even now, I don't think I fully understand what I saw. But one thing is certain. I never drove through that part of the countryside again, and I doubt I ever will. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted backroads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk in the old neighborhood park that bordered the edge of town. The park wasn't particularly large, but it had always felt familiar, almost like a second home growing up. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted branches stretching across the paths, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been years since I last wandered through these trails, but I always felt drawn back whenever I needed space to think. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler, the rustling leaves crunching softly beneath my feet. There were hardly any other people around, which only added to the sense of solitude. I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The park was rarely crowded during the evening hours. I figured it would be a peaceful walk, perfect to clear my head after a long day. I passed a small, decrepit wooden bench half buried beneath overgrown vines. It was an old fixture from the days of my childhood. I paused for a moment, staring at the faded graffiti that had long since been swallowed by moss. The bench felt like a quiet witness to countless secrets from the past, memories of old friendships and whispered promises. As I continued along the trail, I noticed the faint sound of running water. A small creek weaved its way through the park, barely noticeable until now. The gentle babble of the stream was oddly calming, and I decided to follow its course. The path led me to a clearing, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by tall, leafy trees. The sunset painted the water in hues of amber and gold, reflecting the serene beauty of the surroundings. I sat down by the edge, my feet dipping into the cool, clear water. The sound of the water lapping against the rocks was soothing. I lost track of time, simply sitting there, letting my thoughts wander. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to melt away, replaced by an eerie stillness. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed almost too quiet. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting through the leaves. But as I strained to listen, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "I'm here." The words were barely more than a breath, carried by the faint breeze. My heart jolted. I glanced around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The park was known for its stillness, for its isolated atmosphere. Maybe it was just the wind, bending the branches and creating phantom sounds. Still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm here. Please, stay." My pulse quickened and I stood up, backing away from the water's edge. The feeling of being watched returned, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something. Something was there, hidden just beyond the trees. I turned and began walking quickly toward the trail. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were moving closer. Each step I took sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, I felt it. A cold, bony hand grasping at my arm. I froze, unable to move, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the cold of its touch, something impossibly dry and lifeless. "I told you." "Stay," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear this time. The air seemed to vibrate around me, thick and suffocating. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the rising panic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The grip tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Don't leave," the voice continued, quieter this time, almost desperate. "You can't." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released. I staggered back, my heart pounding, and ran as fast as I could toward the distant glow of the city. I haven't been back to that park since. And every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, soft and haunting, reminding me that whatever was there is still waiting. I still remember that trip to the old library. It wasn't like the modern ones with glass walls and computer stations. This library had a heavy, musty smell, old wooden shelves creaking beneath countless books. The kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while wandering through a quiet, forgotten town. The library sat at the edge of a narrow, winding street. We were drawn to it, not by any plan but by sheer curiosity. It looked abandoned, its windows cracked, paint peeling from the facade. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the wind, its faded letters barely readable. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the world. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light. I remember feeling a strange stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. There was no one there, just the four of us. We wandered through the aisles, running our fingers along the spines of the old books, their titles long forgotten. The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The silence seemed to throb, each creak of the wooden floorboards louder than it should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal resting on one of the shelves that things started to feel off. The journal was thick, its cover worn with age. I opened it, curious, and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, filled with strange symbols and passages that made no sense. Some entries were incomprehensible. Others spoke of things that shouldn't be known. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the scribbles, my hands trembling as I flipped further. But what truly unsettled me was a single line written on the very last page. It was as if someone had scrawled it in a panic, hurried and jagged. "They are watching. They have always been watching." I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Anything. But the library remained empty. The others were still exploring, oblivious to the unease that had taken hold of me. I hurried to put the journal back, but when I turned around, the air grew colder. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the same old shelves and the thick silence. My friends returned, laughing about some old book they'd found. I couldn't tell them about what I had seen. What if they thought I was imagining things? Or worse, what if they laughed it off like it was nothing? We stayed for a while longer, trying to enjoy the quiet atmosphere. But every so often, I felt those eyes again. Watching, always watching. The feeling stayed with me long after we left the library, and to this day, I wonder who or what was there, waiting for us. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town, nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello," my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs, as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. It was a summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood park. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown trails. I had lived in this town my entire life, but I had always avoided this park, partly because it had a reputation, mostly forgotten now, of being haunted or unsettling. People used to talk about strange noises, whispers, and figures moving through the trees, but I never paid much attention to those stories. That night, though, I needed some quiet, some space to clear my head. The park wasn't far from my home, just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the old oaks loomed over the trails and the air smelled thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I strolled down the main path, the woods on either side seemed darker than I remembered, the trees taller and more imposing. The usual sounds of the city were distant now, just the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of insects. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. I had a strange feeling, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. I passed by an old wooden bench, splintered and half-rotted, its paint chipped and faded. It had been there forever, the kind of thing no one really paid attention to anymore. But something about it caught my eye. A faint scratch, almost too faint to notice, ran down the bench's surface. The marks looked as if they'd been made by long, sharp claws. I paused for a moment, staring at the bench, my heart thudding harder. It couldn't have been anything natural. No animal could have left such clean, precise scratches. Maybe kids had vandalized it, but the deeper I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as though those marks weren't meant to be there at all. I shook off the unease and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I ventured further into the park, I noticed something strange. The trees weren't swaying with the breeze like they should have been. Instead, the branches hung motionless, as if the wind itself had vanished. Then came the sound. A low, raspy whisper carried by the stillness. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, as though it had traveled from far away. I stopped, listening, but the whisper faded before I could make out any words. My stomach twisted into knots, and I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, as though I could outrun whatever had made that sound. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a figure partially obscured by the thick trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't look human. Its outline was too tall, too lanky, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Shadows seemed to crawl along its body, swallowing it whole. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something stir inside me. A primal fear I couldn't explain. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift or move. It simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. But as I passed, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I clenched my fists, willing my legs to carry me faster. A rustling behind me snapped my attention back. I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there it was again. The whisper, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, just fragments, like someone muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed to bend toward me now, their branches brushing the path like fingers reaching out. The unease grew until it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course, there was nothing but static in this part of the park, and I had no way to call for help even if I wanted to. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, this time closer, closer than I'd ever imagined. It was right behind me now, following, breathing down my neck. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the woods, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Who's there? I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, just the whisper. Louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The whisper, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. All of it disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking, every step trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn something was still there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. The park finally gave way to the street, and as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. I've never gone back to the park. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical. It was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something. Anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again. The woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there. She was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. But the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that. And I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple. Take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it. Like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now. Too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I didn't believe in anything strange, spirits, haunted places, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until the night we went camping deep in the forest. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away from everything, but what we encountered still haunts me. We found a spot off the beaten trail, miles from the nearest campground. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. It felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the outside world. We set up camp beneath towering pines, built a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It wasn't until we fell silent that I realized something was off. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the gentle hum of the breeze, had stopped. Completely. The night felt unnervingly still. Even my friends, usually loud and talkative, grew quiet, as though we were all waiting for something we couldn't name. Around midnight, the wind returned, but it was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. The fire flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing around. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't. That's when we heard it, the sound of someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't the crunch of leaves or the soft padding of paws. It was something heavier, more human, but not quite right. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, our nerves taut. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. "Maybe it's an animal," I offered weakly, though none of us truly believed it. The footsteps grew louder, circling our camp. They came from all directions, and it didn't take long to realize whoever, or whatever, was moving wasn't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear. I stood up, heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. My friends followed my gaze as we watched shadows creep closer through the underbrush. Then it happened. From the trees, something emerged. Something that wasn't human, but not quite a creature either. It was tall, far too tall for any person, with limbs that bent unnaturally and skin that seemed to ripple like water. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, except for two black, hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. "Run," someone whispered, and we all turned to flee. But the figure didn't move like we did. It glided silently through the trees, faster than we could ever hope to outrun it. We could hear it, feel its presence as though it was right behind us, always just a step away. We made it back to the car, slammed the doors shut, locked them, and peeled away from the woods as fast as we could. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The image of that thing, its endless eyes watching us from the shadows, was burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can still feel its gaze. I don't know what it was or why it followed us. All I know is that sometimes some places leave scars deeper than memory. It was a quiet summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and soak in the stillness of the countryside. We left town with no real plan, winding down narrow back roads, passing the occasional farmhouse and letting the radio fill the silence. We ended up on an old, forgotten road, the kind with broken pavement and weeds pushing through cracks. It stretched on for miles, empty except for the occasional crows circling above. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a dull orange glow. We pulled over at a random spot where the trees opened up, leaving a stretch of land that felt completely isolated. The silence was heavier now, the kind that creeps into your chest, making it harder to breathe. We got out of the car, stretched, and walked a few feet to sit on the hood, staring out at the horizon. It felt perfect, peaceful, distant, far from the chaos of everything. But as the minutes stretched on, a strange sense of tension began to creep in. My friend Jess was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of wind through the grass, but then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, echoing sound. A voice, perhaps, or something that barely resembled one. It was hard to tell. The sound came and went, almost like breathing, but slower, heavier. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some far-off noise we couldn't identify. But it didn't sit right. There was something too deliberate about it, like it was aware of us. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. We relaxed a bit, laughed nervously, and chalked it up to our imagination. But as soon as we settled back into our thoughts, we heard it again. This time, it was closer, more distinct. A whisper, drawn out, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. We all leaned in, listening harder now. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the clearing, just beyond where we could see. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us. "Let's get back to the car," I said, standing up. My voice was shaky. The fear I felt wasn't like any I'd ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual. But as we turned to walk back, we heard it again. Closer this time, and clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was laughter. A low, hollow laughter, chilling in its emptiness. It didn't sound like any human laugh. It wasn't playful. It was wrong. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Our feet moved faster, scrambling back toward the car, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees. When we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors shut and locked them. I could barely see through the windshield, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The laughter didn't stop. It was all around us now, growing louder, closer. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just as I was about to start the engine, Jess screamed. I turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes empty and hollow, watching us from the edge of the woods. We didn't hesitate. The car roared to life, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the empty road. The figure remained behind, standing motionless as we drove away. But I could still hear the laughter, trailing off into the distance. Even now, I wonder what was out there that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some animal, something we couldn't understand. But the look in its eyes, empty and hollow, tells me otherwise. Whatever was there, whatever followed us, is still out there. I've always loved the city at night, the neon lights, the quiet hum of cars far off in the distance. There's something peaceful about it. I never thought much of urban legends or ghost stories. They always felt too far-fetched for someone like me, someone who preferred logic and reason. But one night, everything changed. It was a routine evening walk through the city, something I'd done countless times before. I left my apartment, heading toward the park that bordered the edge of downtown. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional footsteps echoing beneath the towering skyscrapers. I didn't mind the quiet. It felt peaceful, a rare escape from the buzz of the day. As I walked, I passed by a small, dimly lit convenience store, its fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trash to skitter across the pavement. The park was just a block away, so I decided to cut through and take the shortcut. The park was eerily quiet, even for the middle of the night. The usual sounds of the city seemed to vanish. No distant traffic, no voices from the few people that might wander through. It was as though the park had been consumed by some invisible void. I took another step and realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The sensation prickled at the back of my neck and my pulse quickened. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of trees looming over the pathway. Probably just my nerves, I muttered to myself. I took a deep breath and started walking again, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The quiet became oppressive, the kind that weighs down your chest and makes you question if you're really alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of something trailing behind me in the dark. Every step I took felt heavier, more deliberate, as though something, or someone, was watching from the shadows, waiting. I reached a clearing near the center of the park where an old, rusted bench sat under a single street lamp that flickered intermittently. I hesitated, looking around, but still saw no sign of anyone. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, blending into the darkness, watching. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, carried by the wind. Not words, just a low, indistinct murmur, as if the air itself was speaking. My heart pounded harder. I instinctively stepped back, my breath quick and shallow. I wasn't alone. Something moved in the shadows, shifting just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. I froze, eyes wide, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing, just darkness and the faint sound of rustling leaves. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I started walking faster now, trying to shake the overwhelming feeling of dread. But the whisper followed me, growing louder, more persistent. My mind raced, wondering if I'd somehow stumbled into some bizarre dream or hallucination. I kept expecting to turn a corner and see someone, or something, standing there, watching me from the darkness. But nothing came. As I neared the edge of the park, I felt something brush against my leg. I jerked back, heart pounding. There was nothing there. The whisper had grown into a chorus of faint voices, overlapping and unintelligible as though a crowd of whispers was surrounding me, closing in. Panic set in. I broke into a sprint, sprinting as fast as I could out of the park, back toward the street where my apartment was. My breath came in short, ragged gasps and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. When I reached the edge of the park, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my apartment, doors bolted, lights on. The next morning, I told myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination, maybe caused by stress or exhaustion. But I can't forget the feeling of being followed, of those whispers in the dark, of something just beyond my sight. To this day, I still wonder if I was truly alone that night, or if something not human, was watching me, waiting. I had always loved driving, long road trips, winding highways, and the sense of freedom they brought. That's why I decided to take an impromptu trip one evening, just to escape the noise of the city. No destination in mind, just me, my car, and an open road stretching ahead. It was around 10 p.m. when I hit the road. The air was crisp and the moon hung low in the sky, casting its silver glow on the empty highways. I didn't mind the quiet. The roads were deserted, and aside from the occasional passing car, I felt like I had the world to myself. Hours passed, and I found myself driving through farmland. The fields stretched on for miles, with barns and old wooden fences lining the road. I kept going, entranced by the solitude and the sound of the tires humming on the pavement. There wasn't a soul in sight. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I thought it was someone out for a late-night stroll. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't quite human. The figure moved in a way that didn't make sense. Its steps were slow, almost unnatural, like it was gliding rather than walking. It wore a tattered coat that seemed too large for its frame, trailing behind like something out of a dream. The closer I got, the more I felt that something wasn't right. I slowed the car, unsure what to do. The figure turned its head slowly, almost mechanically, and locked eyes with me. There was no expression on its face, just hollow, empty blackness where eyes should have been. Panic shot through me. I didn't know whether to stop or speed away. But something kept me glued to my seat, unable to look away. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind I was used to. It was as though I was being drawn in, compelled to stay and witness whatever this was. As I drove past, the figure continued its slow, unnatural pace. I turned to glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind me. But there it was again, staring at me, still moving forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as if whatever that thing was still out there, trailing me through the night. Minutes passed in silence, but the weight of the encounter lingered. I drove faster, trying to outrun whatever had followed me. My heart pounded in my chest, each mile marker flashing by like a countdown. Eventually, I found a small gas station tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I pulled in, trying to catch my breath. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and forced myself to sit on one of the benches outside. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it had been a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. Just as I was about to get back in my car, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned, expecting nothing. But there it was again, standing at the edge of the gas station, staring at me with those hollow black eyes. It didn't move closer, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. I sat frozen, my breath hitching. The air grew colder, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, in a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own mind, I heard it again. "You can't escape." I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, leaving the figure behind. The road stretched out ahead of me, endless and dark, but no matter how fast I drove, I knew I couldn't outrun whatever had been following me. It was still there, waiting in the shadows. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed. a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold, a trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive. The kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still. too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved, just a twitch of its head, too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures, all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple: spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again, though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving, it felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run, though my legs ached. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home along the old highway, a stretch of road I'd traveled countless times before. The highway was long, desolate, cutting through empty fields that stretched on for miles. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just me and the endless blackness. As I drove, I noticed something strange. About halfway home, I passed a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was someone stranded, maybe they lived nearby. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I realized they were still there, walking in the same direction. I didn't see their face, only the silhouette of someone in a dark coat. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and they walked as though they didn't notice my car at all. My instinct told me to stop, to ask if they needed help, but something about their movements didn't sit right. They weren't stumbling or waving for help. They just kept walking, their figure blending into the darkness like they belonged there. I kept driving, the unease growing in my gut. I checked the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, now further back, just as distant and unchanging as before. By the time I reached the next bend, the figure was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, relieved. Maybe they'd turned off the road, or found whatever they were looking for. But as I approached the next stretch of road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing there, just a few feet from where I had last seen them. This time, they were facing the road. Their head was tilted, watching me as I drove closer. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. There was something about the way they moved, so slow, so deliberate, that sent a chill through me. I could feel their gaze locked onto my car. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself they were just lost, maybe trying to get to a destination. But that thought didn't comfort me. There was something deeply unnatural about how still they stood, how they didn't react to the passing cars or the distant sound of my horn. As I approached, I noticed the figure wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, off into the horizon as though something far beyond the road had their attention. I hesitated, watching in horror as they began to move again, this time walking toward the trees at the edge of the field. I didn't stop to watch. I sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was that? Why were they walking down the highway like that, so out of place? When I finally made it home, the house felt too quiet. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe they were a hitchhiker who wandered off into the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The figure wasn't normal. They had felt off, wrong, in ways I couldn't explain. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see them again, standing in the darkness, watching. I've never driven that stretch of road again. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I went for a hike. I wasn't a hiker, far from it. I was out of shape, but the trails near the mountains had always called to me. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I decided to take a trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main paths and the familiar sounds of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I didn't care. It felt freeing to be away from the constant noise of phones, people, and the city. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift as I lost track of time. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like the gradual descent into something off. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became eerily silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, almost unnatural. I noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should have, growing darker, more menacing. My stomach twisted. I stopped and looked around, unsure why I felt so uncomfortable. Everything seemed the same. Trees, rocks, the trail, but something wasn't right. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the forest. There was no one, just the trees, endless and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail curved ahead, leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't want to go any farther. I wanted to turn back. My breath grew ragged, and with each step the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Then I heard it. The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like my name, softly spoken, carried on the wind. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The forest was still, except for the sound of my own breathing. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I kept walking, but every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave. I glanced back once, and for a moment I could swear I saw something. Just a flash of movement, disappearing behind a tree. My pace quickened, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. Panic gripped me. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't see the end. The woods felt endless, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. I could barely make out the path beneath my feet. Then I heard it again. A voice, closer this time, clearer, more distinct. "Turn back," it said, but it wasn't human. It was hollow, distorted, like the echo of something long dead. "Leave this place." I stumbled, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Nothing mattered except getting out. My mind was screaming for answers, but I knew there weren't any. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a clearing. My eyes widened. There, in front of me, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes were black, hollow, and empty. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with a cold, unsettling stare. I stopped, paralyzed by fear. My breath hitched and my legs felt like they would give out. But something inside me told me to run. I had to get away. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, but the forest seemed endless. Every shadow felt alive, every noise a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had followed me from the moment I stepped off the trail. Hours later, I made it out. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I kept running, not knowing if I'd ever escape. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it followed me. The forest isn't the same to me anymore. There's a quiet, lingering fear every time I step into the woods, a reminder of that day when I became lost in a world I couldn't explain. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions. Just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. It started on a quiet summer evening. I was driving down the winding country road, away from the lights of the city and toward the small, rural town I called home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a deep, orange glow behind the trees. I wasn't in a rush. The journey was peaceful. Nothing but open fields stretching out on either side of the road. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, just a text from a friend reminding me to take the back route. The usual traffic's a nightmare, they'd said. I smiled and checked the screen. Sure enough, there were no cars ahead, no one behind me. The road was empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, I felt the weight of the quiet settle around me. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of distant crickets. I took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over me. It was so different from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized how still they were. The figure didn't move. No wave, no glance, just standing there, perfectly still, like a mannequin. I passed them without slowing down, my pulse quickening. I told myself they were probably just lost, maybe hitchhiking. But the image of that unmoving figure stuck with me. A few miles further, I came across another one, and this time closer to the edge of a small, overgrown field. The figure stood just a few feet from the road, completely still. staring off into the distance. I passed by, this time slower, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There were more. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I had counted 5. All of them standing still at the side of the road, staring into the darkness, unmoving. I was just about to dismiss the whole thing when a shiver ran down my spine. What if they weren't people? What if they weren't even real? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Not just standing there waiting, but following. It wasn't until I was almost home that I realized something else. They hadn't moved. I made it back safe, but the silence of that night, the sight of those figures, still haunts me. I still drive that road sometimes, hoping to find some explanation, but I never do.